The airport hummed with the familiar buzz of travelers in motion, voices mingling, luggage wheels clattering, the occasional call for a final boarding over the loudspeaker. In the middle of this organized chaos, Imani Carter moved with purpose, her stride confident, heels clicking in rhythm against the polished floor. She was used to navigating through bustling terminals. But today felt different. Today, she was headed to San Francisco to close a deal that could reshape the trajectory of her career and redefine the future of her company. At 32, Imani had ascended the ranks of the tech world with impressive speed, climbing from an entry-level analyst to vice president of strategic partnerships at TechSoul Innovations. Her title didn't come from luck, it was earned from countless late nights, meticulous research, and a relentless dedication to excellence. Today's meeting was months in the making, a potential multi-million-dollar partnership that could cement TechSoul's place in the rapidly evolving world of artificial intelligence. Imani had spent hours perfecting her presentation, anticipating every question and counterpoint, determined to leave her mark in an industry that rarely welcomed women like her, let alone women of color, at its highest levels. As she approached her gate, Imani caught a glimpse of herself in the glass reflection. Her tailored charcoal suit, crisp white blouse, and subtle gold jewelry conveyed professionalism, while her natural curls, pinned into an elegant updo, spoke of pride in her heritage. A small smile touched her lips as she remembered the little girl she once was, back in Lagos, Nigeria, who dreamed of breaking barriers and making a name for herself. That girl was now a woman standing on the threshold of her dreams. The announcement for first-class boarding pulled her from her thoughts. Imani moved forward, her boarding pass and ID ready, her mind already rehearsing the key points she would lead with at tomorrow's meeting. She handed her documents to the gate agent, noting the fleeting moment of surprise in the woman's eyes, an expression she had grown used to. She knew what people saw, a young black woman in a designer suit traveling in first class. To some, it was a disconnect, a puzzle they couldn't immediately piece together. But Imani met the agent's brief stare with a polite smile, refusing to let such subtle microaggressions disturb her sense of purpose. Stepping onto the plane, the familiar scent of vanilla and leather greeted her in the first-class cabin. Imani found her seat, 3A, and began settling in, pulling out her tablet to review last-minute data points. Around her, the cabin buzzed with pre-flight activity, a businessman muttering over an oversized carry-on, an elderly couple playfully bickering over what movies to watch, a mother whispering to her young child who was excitedly pointing out every detail in sight. For most passengers, this was just another flight. But for Imani, it was a gateway to something monumental. She was just about to put on her noise-canceling headphones and dive into her final preparations when an unexpected voice cut through her concentration. "Hey, you there. I need help with my bag." She looked up, momentarily disoriented, her gaze landing on a middle-aged man across the aisle. His face was fixed in a scowl of impatience. His eyes narrowed as he gestured at her, clearly assuming she was part of the flight crew. For a moment, Imani blinked, thrown off by his tone and demand. Surely, she thought, he couldn't be talking to her. But as he continued to glare, the uncomfortable realization settled over her like a shadow. This wasn't the first time a stranger had mistaken her for help, and yet, it never failed to catch her off guard. Imani's fingers tightened around the tablet on her lap, her mind racing. Years in corporate America had taught her how to handle situations like this, to maintain a calm, controlled composure. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts and her pride, before looking the man in the eye. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice steady and unruffled. "But I'm not a flight attendant. I'm a passenger, just like you." The man barely glanced at her, his tone dripping with condescension as he waved her words away with a flick of his hand. Sure. Just put my bag in the overhead compartment and bring me a glass of champagne. Make it quick, all right?" Imani felt a flash of anger, sharp and biting. Around her, a few passengers exchanged glances, some looking away, others watching with thinly veiled interest. She could feel their eyes on her, the quiet tension of the moment hanging heavy in the air. But alongside the familiar weight of their stares came an equally familiar resolve, a resilience forged in boardrooms, late-night strategy sessions, and years of quietly proving herself in spaces that weren't designed to welcome her. As the businessman's impatient glare remained fixed on her, Imani took another deep breath, centering herself. She had no intention of letting this pass without challenge, no matter how polished or poised. She refused to let anyone diminish her presence. She straightened in her seat, meeting his gaze with calm defiance. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding or a rude passenger, this was about the principle. About standing up for her place. Her right to be seen for who she truly was. Sir, she began. Her voice clear and unwavering. I think it's time we set the record straight. The businessman's scowl deepened. Impatience rolling off him in waves as he jutted his chin toward Imani. Not even bothering to make eye contact. The casual dismissiveness in his manner stung. A sharp reminder of countless quiet indignities Imani had endured over the years. Look, I don't know why you're making this difficult, he huffed. Still gesturing at his oversized carry-on. Just put it up and get me my drink. That's what you're here for, isn't it? Imani felt the words land. Cold and cutting. There was a ripple of discomfort around her. A murmur from a few passengers. Some looking on with sympathetic glances while others shifted in their seats, averting their eyes. She could feel the weight of their silent observation. The cabin's collective tension settling around her like a fog. But if years in corporate America had taught her anything, it was the power of poise. She took a deep breath. Her grip on her tablet loosening as she straightened her shoulders. Lifting her chin. She was done pretending to ignore his disrespect. Sir, she said. Her voice steady and filled with a quiet strength. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I am not a flight attendant. I am a passenger. Just like you. For a brief moment. The man paused. His brows drawing together as he gave her a once-over. His gaze flickered over her tailored suit. Her carefully styled hair. And the tablet in her hands. His expression wavered. A flicker of doubt crossing his face. But it quickly hardened into a sneer. Oh. Right, he scoffed. Sarcasm dripping from his voice. And I suppose you're the CEO of some Fortune 500 company too. Huh? The disbelief in his tone hit her like a slap. Imani felt her pulse quicken. A hot flush creeping up her neck. She had faced these assumptions her whole life. That no matter how high she climbed, there would always be people who saw only her skin color or her gender. Never her achievements. But she was not about to let this man define her. Imani leaned forward, meeting his gaze with unwavering confidence. Her voice calm but edged with steel. Actually, sir, I'm the Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at TechSoul Innovations. We're a leading player in AI technology. And I'm on my way to San Francisco to lead a meeting with investors for a multi-million-dollar deal. The businessman's mouth opened slightly. Surprise flickering across his face before he quickly masked it. He leaned back in his seat, visibly thrown off balance. But he tried to rally, muttering defensively. Well, you should have said something sooner. How was I supposed to know? Imani felt a pang of anger at his dismissal. But she held her composure. Her voice steady and even as she replied. Perhaps the issue here, sir, isn't what I failed to say but rather what you assumed. And I think it's time we talk about why that is. A small gasp rippled through the cabin. Imani felt the eyes of passengers on her now. Not out of idle curiosity, but out of genuine interest. As though they, too, were wondering how this exchange would unfold. The businessman shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to being challenged so directly. Now, wait a minute, he stammered. A hint of defensiveness creeping into his voice. I didn't mean anything by it. I just thought that I couldn't possibly be sitting here as an executive. As an equal, she interjected. Her tone controlled yet unyielding. You didn't think, sir. You assumed. And that assumption speaks volumes. Around them, the murmurs grew louder. An elderly couple exchanged nods of agreement. A young mother gave Imani a small, encouraging smile. Imani could feel the atmosphere shifting. A palpable tension giving way to a collective awareness. Look, the man tried again. His voice wavering. I was just trying to get some help. I don't know why you're making this into a big deal. Imani's gaze remained steady. Her words clear and resolute. It's a big deal because assumptions like yours have very real consequences. They're the kind of assumptions that follow people like me into boardrooms, into job interviews, into everyday interactions. They create invisible barriers that force us to work twice as hard just to be seen as equal. The businessman's face flushed, his bravado visibly deflating as he struggled to find a response. I'm sorry, he mumbled, though his voice was low, as if he hoped no one else could hear. But Imani had no intention of letting him off so easily. This wasn't just about her, it was about every person who had been judged or underestimated because of someone else's bias. This was her chance to turn a moment of humiliation into an opportunity for awareness. And she wasn't about to waste it. Sir, she said, her voice carrying through the cabin. This isn't just about your words. It's about the way we see each other. The assumptions we make without thinking. Those assumptions don't just harm individuals, they harm communities. They limit possibilities. And they reflect an underlying bias that, quite frankly, We all need to confront. The businessman finally looked her in the eye. His gaze softened by something she couldn't quite place, remorse. Perhaps. Or maybe just the first inkling of understanding. He swallowed hard. His face pale. His previous arrogance gone. A long silence stretched between them. Thick with tension yet charged with something more, a possibility for change. Perhaps. Or at least a moment of self-reflection. Imani held his gaze a second longer, making sure her words settled before she leaned back in her seat, releasing the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The cabin was silent now. Passengers watching her with newfound respect. Some even nodding in approval. The businessman, his face red with embarrassment, finally slumped back into his seat, muttering apologies under his breath. He didn't meet her eyes again, choosing instead to look down, avoiding the stares of those around him. Imani closed her eyes briefly, feeling the rush of adrenaline begin to subside. She had made her point, but she knew this moment would linger, not just for her, but for every person who had watched it unfold. This was more than a confrontation, it was a stand for dignity. A reminder of the strength it took to face prejudice and meet it head-on. As the plane began its taxi to the runway, Imani felt a renewed sense of purpose. This flight was supposed to be a gateway to a business deal. But it was becoming something much larger, a chance to challenge perceptions. To demand respect. To inspire change. And as she looked around the cabin, catching the grateful and respectful glances of her fellow passengers, she knew she had done just that. Imani's pulse still raced from the confrontation. The echoes of her words lingering in the silent cabin. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her. Some filled with admiration. Others with introspective surprise. The businessman across the aisle seemed to shrink into his seat. His gaze cast down. His previous arrogance now transformed into palpable discomfort. But Imani knew this wasn't just about him. This was about everyone watching. Everyone who might carry similar biases without realizing it. She sensed that this was a rare opportunity to reach a captive audience and address a much larger issue, an issue that stretched far beyond a single flight or one rude passenger. Taking a deep breath, she turned, addressing the businessman but speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "Sir, I understand that you may not have intended to offend me," she began. Her voice calm but filled with conviction. "But the assumptions you made speak to a larger problem. It's a problem that affects not only me but millions of people who face similar biases every day." The cabin was silent. Passengers leaning in slightly, drawn to the clarity and strength of her voice. Even the flight attendants had slowed their pre-flight preparations, glancing over to listen. The businessman shifted uncomfortably, still avoiding her gaze. "I said I was sorry," he mumbled, as if hoping to end the conversation. Imani remained undeterred. Sometimes, an apology isn't enough. This isn't about a simple misunderstanding, it's about the assumptions we carry with us. Assumptions that have real consequences for people who don't fit a certain mold. She let her gaze sweep across the cabin, making eye contact with passengers who nodded in silent agreement. Her tone softened slightly, taking on a personal edge as she spoke from her own experiences. "I've worked hard to be where I am today. I've faced challenges, overcome obstacles, and proven myself in a world that often refuses to see people like me as equal. And yet, the moment I step into a space that's usually reserved for people who look a certain way, I am still judged, still questioned." A murmur rippled through the cabin, a mixture of agreement and reflection. An elderly woman in the row ahead of her nodded with a small smile of approval, and a young mother nearby gave her a look of admiration. The businessman, visibly uncomfortable, fidgeted with his tie, clearly grappling with his own role in this moment. Imani decided to drive the point home. "Sir, it's not just you who made an assumption about me today. It's the system we live in, a system that often dictates who belongs where, based on appearance alone. But if we want things to change, we need to start by examining these biases and challenging them." The businessman finally looked up, meeting her gaze with an expression that was a mixture of shame and reluctant understanding. I guess I never thought of it that way," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Imani softened, sensing the breakthrough. "I appreciate your willingness to listen. It's the first step. And it's not easy. Recognizing our own biases is hard because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. But if we're serious about creating a better, more inclusive world, we need to start with self-awareness." The man nodded slowly, visibly humbled, his earlier bravado replaced by a look of introspection. "I really am sorry," he murmured, his voice carrying a sincerity that hadn't been there before. "And I'll try to do better." Imani gave him a small nod, acknowledging his apology. She knew change wouldn't happen overnight, But she could see the beginnings of a shift within him. A glimmer of understanding that might carry beyond this flight. The cabin seemed to exhale collectively. The tension lifting as the other passengers relaxed. Many still watching her with admiration. Across the aisle, an elderly man leaned over to his wife, nodding approvingly, while a young woman further back looked at Imani with open admiration. The quiet, profound impact of her words hung in the air like an unspoken promise. A flight attendant approached, her voice gentle, her eyes filled with respect. "Ms. Carter, is there anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable?" Imani smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you. But no. I think what matters most is that we all walk away from this experience having learned something." The flight attendant nodded, a warm smile playing at her lips as she moved to continue her duties. Imani turned back to her seat, settling in with a sense of purpose she hadn't expected to find on this flight. She was no stranger to overcoming obstacles. But the chance to challenge perceptions and make a difference in real time felt like an unexpected victory. She glanced around the cabin one last time, catching the supportive glances and nods from fellow passengers. This wasn't just a small, fleeting moment of confrontation, it was a seed of change. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful lessons happen in unexpected places. As she returned to her notes, a renewed resolve filled her. She was no longer just preparing for a business meeting. This trip had become something larger. A testament to her resilience, her dignity, and her unwavering belief that change was possible, one conversation, one challenge, one flight at a time. As the plane continued its ascent, the cabin settled into a contemplative hush. Passengers who had witnessed the exchange between Imani and the businessman seemed almost reverent, casting her glances filled with admiration or quiet introspection. Some leaned in toward their neighbors, murmuring reflections about what they'd just seen. The weight of Imani's words resonating well beyond her seat. Imani could feel the pulse of adrenaline slowly ebbing, her heartbeat finding its natural rhythm again. She glanced out the window, watching the clouds slip by, feeling a profound sense of both accomplishment and exhaustion. Her life had been filled with countless, often invisible battles, proving her worth in boardrooms, silencing critics who thought she didn't belong, showing up again and again with dignity intact. But never before had her words created a shift so immediate, so palpable. She turned to her tablet, intending to focus on her presentation for the next day's meeting. Yet, her mind kept drifting back to the faces in the cabin, the elderly couple nodding in approval, the young mother who had given her a look of admiration, and even the businessman who now sat in silence, visibly humbled. The words she'd spoken seemed to hang in the air, heavy with a significance she hadn't anticipated. Imani's thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice. "Excuse me, Ms. Carter?" She looked up to find the young woman from a few rows back, her face a blend of nerves and admiration. She held a business card, extending it to Imani with a hesitant smile. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman began, her voice wavering slightly. "Watching you stand up for yourself like that, it was inspiring. I'm just starting my career. And, well, I worry sometimes about how I'll be treated or whether I'll be taken seriously." Her voice grew firmer, more determined. "But seeing you today, speaking so confidently, so unapologetically, it gave me courage." Imani felt a surge of warmth as she took the woman's card, her smile genuine. "Thank you for sharing that with me," she replied. "Remember, you have every right to be where you are. And don't ever let anyone make you doubt that." The young woman nodded, her eyes bright with resolve. As she returned to her seat, Imani felt a flicker of pride, a sense that perhaps her small act of resistance had ignited something greater, a ripple effect, an inspiration that could carry forward long after this flight. Across the aisle, the elderly couple leaned over, the woman reaching out to touch Imani's arm gently. "My dear," she said, her voice warm with admiration, "I want you to know that what you did today, well, it's restored our faith. We need more people like you in this world, people willing to speak truth to power with grace and dignity." Imani smiled, gratitude swelling within her. She felt the weight of their words, the encouragement of a generation who had witnessed their own struggles and victories. In their eyes, she saw a reflection of her own resilience, a reminder that she was part of a larger legacy. Meanwhile, the businessman who had sparked the incident sat in his seat, shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the closed window shade beside him. The smug confidence he'd worn so boldly earlier had dissolved, replaced by an expression of subdued reflection. She could almost see the wheels turning in his mind, the uncomfortable confrontation forcing him to examine himself in ways he hadn't anticipated. A flight attendant approached him quietly, offering to bring his requested champagne, but he waved her away. barely acknowledging her presence. Instead, he sat in silence. His face etched with the weight of realization, a man beginning to comprehend the far-reaching implications of his own assumptions. Imani felt a surge of empathy. A faint glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he would carry this moment with him and use it to challenge his own biases in the future. She knew that real change didn't happen overnight, but she could feel the possibility unfolding before her. As the plane settled into its cruise, Imani found herself lost in thought, reflecting on what had just transpired. Her confrontation with the businessman had been more than a moment of standing up for herself. It had been an opportunity to confront an issue woven into the fabric of society. A chance to create a ripple that might extend far beyond the confines of this cabin. Imani glanced around once more, noticing how the passengers' expressions had shifted. There was a kind of quiet reverence in the air, as though they'd just witnessed something sacred. A moment that challenged their own perspectives. She hoped that some of them, at least, would carry her words with them, using this experience to reflect on their own assumptions and to treat others with more respect. The mother with the young child smiled at her from across the cabin, mouthing a soft, "Thank you." The elderly couple continued to give her approving nods, and even the flight attendants stole glances, a few of them sharing knowing smiles. In their eyes, Imani saw not only gratitude but something more, a recognition of the strength it took to turn a moment of humiliation into one of education and empowerment. She returned her focus to her tablet, but this time with a new sense of purpose. Her upcoming meeting in San Francisco was still important, but she felt that she'd already accomplished something even more significant. Today, she hadn't just prepared to close a deal, she had opened minds, challenged prejudice, and, perhaps, inspired others to confront their own biases. As the plane glided through the sky, Imani felt a quiet, powerful certainty within her. She knew she was on the right path, not just in her career, but in her journey as a voice for change. She had turned an uncomfortable confrontation into a lesson, a small victory in the long, ongoing struggle for equality and respect. With a deep breath, she settled back in her seat, the clouds drifting past the window as she prepared for what lay ahead. Whatever the future held, she was ready to face it, fortified by the knowledge that her actions, her courage, and her voice had the power to transform not only this moment but countless others to come. As the plane cruised steadily over the vast, cloud-dotted sky, Imani sensed a collective stillness in the first-class cabin, a pause that felt profound, as if every passenger was rethinking their place in the world. Conversations had dwindled to a murmur. The businessman across the aisle sat slouched in his seat, eyes cast downward, looking like he'd been stripped of his once easy confidence. She could tell he was grappling with his own discomfort, perhaps realizing the extent of his assumptions and the quiet power of the lesson he'd just learned. The quiet in the cabin was broken as the young mother leaned across the aisle, her face glowing with quiet admiration. "Ms. Carter," she whispered, not wanting to disturb the cabin's solemn hush. "I just want you to know that my son and I, well, we're grateful for what you said. Thank you for speaking up. I want my son to grow up in a world where he doesn't judge people by how they look." She gave Imani's hand a gentle squeeze, a silent gesture of respect. Imani smiled warmly at the mother, feeling the weight of her gratitude and the silent promise in her words. For a brief moment, she imagined a world where moments like this, moments where people confronted and unlearned their biases, became the norm. Where mothers and fathers raised their children with the understanding that everyone deserves respect and dignity. Across the aisle, the businessman finally looked up, clearing his throat. His face was still pale, his expression marked with a new humility she hadn't seen before. He hesitated, his gaze shifting between her and the window, as if struggling to find the right words. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice unsteady, "I want to apologize, again. I know I've already said I'm sorry. But, it's different this time." He paused, his hands fidgeting nervously. I've never thought about it the way you explained it. I assumed things. I just assumed." Imani took a deep breath, giving him a small nod. She could feel the sincerity in his words, the shift in his demeanor as he continued. "I've been in business for over 20 years, he went on, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I thought I was progressive. I've even done those corporate training sessions on diversity." He gave a weak chuckle, a hint of embarrassment creeping into his voice. "But hearing it from you, here, like this, it's different. It's personal. I realize now how much I've been blind to." Imani watched him closely, sensing the depth of his struggle. He seemed genuinely unsettled, as though he was seeing himself with new eyes and recognizing parts of himself he had long overlooked. "Change is hard," she replied gently, her voice soft but firm. It's uncomfortable. And sometimes, it's humbling. But what matters most is that we're open to it. It's not enough to go through training sessions or check off boxes. True change is about rethinking how we see the world, and the people in it. He nodded, swallowing hard, and then looked at her directly. His voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for not letting it slide. I know that would have been easier. But, thank you for holding me accountable. I'll remember this. Around them, other passengers looked on, some subtly nodding in agreement. Imani could feel the energy in the cabin shift again. The atmosphere infused with a newfound respect, not just for her, but for the quiet courage it took to confront prejudice and inspire change. Imani decided to take this moment a step further. She straightened in her seat and addressed the businessman again. But this time, her voice carried so that the entire cabin could hear. This moment isn't just about you and me, she said. It's about all of us. Biases, whether they're conscious or unconscious, shape our interactions, our decisions, our society. And we each have a responsibility to confront and challenge them, not only when it's easy, but especially when it's hard. The cabin was silent, every passenger's attention drawn to her words. She could see their faces reflecting the weight of what she was saying. The realization that this wasn't just about a single incident on a flight, but a much larger issue. We're all here because we've worked hard. Because we've earned our place, she continued. Her voice calm but unyielding. But some of us, women, people of color, people from different backgrounds, face barriers that make us work twice as hard just to be seen, just to be treated as equal. And that's not just unfair, it's harmful to all of us. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Several passengers exchanged glances, thoughtful and introspective. The elderly couple from earlier nodded in silent agreement, and the young mother offered a small, encouraging smile. We can't just be passive, Imani concluded. Real change requires that we speak up, that we take action, that we look at our own biases and work to overcome them. Each of us has the power to make a difference. Whether it's in a boardroom, a classroom, or even on a flight. Let's use it. The businessman, visibly moved, nodded slowly, as if finally absorbing the full weight of her words. He looked at her with an expression that seemed to carry both humility and resolve. You're right, he said, his voice barely audible. I'll remember this moment. And I'll do better. Imani gave him a slight nod, her expression softening as she saw the sincerity in his gaze. She knew that one conversation wouldn't change everything. But this felt like a start. A small, meaningful step forward. Around her, passengers shifted in their seats, some murmuring to each other, others sitting in quiet reflection. The flight attendant approached, her eyes shining with admiration, and quietly offered Imani a complimentary drink. But Imani simply smiled, declining with a gentle shake of her head. Thank you, she whispered. I think this flight has already given me everything I need. As she settled back into her seat, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, a moment to take in the significance of what had happened. She had come onto this flight with her mind focused on a business deal. But she was leaving with something far more valuable, a reminder of her own strength, her ability to affect change, and the importance of using her voice, even in the smallest moments. And as the plane continued its journey across the sky, Imani couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that this encounter had ignited something within her fellow passengers. A spark that could ripple out far beyond this flight. In that quiet cabin, somewhere between takeoff and landing, a catalyst had been ignited, a seed of change planted. And Imani knew that wherever life took her, she would carry this experience with her, using it as a reminder of the power that lay within each of us to make the world a little more just, a little more compassionate, and a lot more inclusive. As the plane descended into San Francisco, Imani felt a calm confidence settle over her, a different kind of assurance than she usually felt before a major business meeting. The past few hours had transformed her flight from a routine journey into something far more powerful. A microcosm of change that she sensed would extend well beyond this cabin. When the plane finally touched down and the seatbelt sign dinged off, a few passengers around her made eye contact, nodding in appreciation and respect. Imani returned their smiles, sensing an unspoken connection. As they began gathering their bags, several paused to offer their thanks. The elderly woman from earlier leaned over, taking Imani's hand in her own. Thank you, dear, she said softly, her eyes warm with gratitude. What you did today, it's something I'll carry with me. We all will. Imani squeezed the woman's hand, nodding. Thank you for listening, she replied, her voice thick with emotion. She could feel the woman's sincerity, the power of shared understanding between them. This was more than a fleeting encounter, it was a reminder of the strength that lay in unity and empathy. As she made her way to the front of the plane, Imani noticed the businessman standing near the exit, waiting to speak with her. His expression was subdued, his posture humble as he approached, looking her in the eye for the first time since their conversation. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice quiet but resolute. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want you to know that I'm deeply sorry. I've been thinking about what you said, and I realize how much I need to learn, how much I have to unlearn. I'll be taking this experience with me, and I'll be working to change. That's a promise." Imani felt a pang of empathy, sensing the weight of his words and the sincerity in his gaze. "I appreciate that," she said, her voice steady but kind. "Recognizing the need for change is the first step, and it's an important one. But remember, it's ongoing work. It's not just one conversation or one moment, it's a commitment." He nodded slowly, a flicker of resolve crossing his face. "I understand," he replied, his voice filled with newfound humility. "Thank you for giving me the chance to do better." Imani offered a small smile, accepting his words with grace. She could tell he meant it, that he was willing to carry this lesson forward. As she exited the plane, the airport seemed to hum with an energy that felt different, charged by the transformation that had taken place. Waiting at the gate was a representative from her company, a young man with wide eyes and a look of awe. "Ms. Carter," he said, stepping forward, "I'm here to escort you to the meeting. But I wanted to let you know, you've gone viral." The whole incident was shared online by one of the passengers. "People are talking about it everywhere, your story. Your message, it's resonating." Imani raised her brows in surprise, feeling a mix of shock and pride. She hadn't expected her experience to travel beyond the confines of the plane, let alone inspire people on such a large scale. But as she processed his words, she realized that this was exactly the ripple effect she had hoped for, a chance to spark change in places she couldn't reach alone. As they walked toward baggage claim, her phone buzzed with messages, emails from colleagues, friends, and even strangers, all commending her for her courage and sharing their own stories of confronting prejudice. The outpouring of support felt overwhelming, yet it filled her with a sense of purpose. Waiting in baggage claim was a small crowd, drawn by the news that had already begun spreading. Among them was a journalist from the San Francisco Chronicle, holding a microphone, her expression one of admiration and excitement. "Ms. Carter," she called out, stepping forward, "would you be willing to share a few words with us? Your story has touched so many people in such a short time." Imani hesitated, but then nodded, understanding the power of her platform. This was her chance to extend the lesson beyond the flight, to bring her message to a wider audience. She took a deep breath and began speaking, her voice calm yet charged with conviction. "What happened on that flight," she said, looking directly into the camera, "is not unique to me. It's an experience many people face every day, being judged by their appearance, assumptions made about their character or worth. But I believe in the power of change, of education, of confronting our own biases and understanding that everyone deserves respect, regardless of how they look or where they come from." The crowd nodded, some wiping away tears, others standing with expressions of quiet determination. Imani could feel her words resonating, sparking something real, something lasting. "It's not enough to say we're against prejudice," she continued. "We have to actively work to dismantle it. That means educating ourselves, holding each other accountable, and standing up in moments that are uncomfortable but necessary. Change doesn't happen by accident, it happens when we commit to making a difference in the world around us, no matter how small the moment may seem." The crowd broke into applause, and Imani felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of fulfillment that went beyond any professional accolade she'd ever achieved. She had used her voice, and in doing so, she had inspired others to use theirs. As the crowd dispersed, the company representative approached, a look of awe still lingering on his face. "Ms. Carter," he said, "I know we're here to discuss a business deal, but our CEO saw the video and called me. He wants to know if you'd consider leading a new diversity and inclusion initiative across the company. He said he's never seen anyone handle a situation with such grace and impact." Imani felt a wave of surprise, yet the idea resonated deeply. She'd come to San Francisco with one mission, but she realized now that her purpose had expanded far beyond a single deal. This was an opportunity to make a lasting impact, to use her experience to drive meaningful change on a much larger scale. She smiled, nodding, "Tell him I'd be honored." As they left the airport, Imani felt a renewed sense of purpose, her journey taking on new dimensions. She knew that what had started as an uncomfortable encounter on a plane had blossomed into something profound, a movement. A catalyst for conversations that needed to happen. The ripple effect of that one moment was already spreading, reaching people she might never meet, touching lives in ways she hadn't imagined. And as the city skyline of San Francisco loomed ahead, she felt ready to step into this new role, to champion a cause that she now understood to her core. The experience on the plane had revealed her purpose in a way she hadn't anticipated, and she was determined to carry this lesson forward, to inspire change. Not just in her company, but in every person who crossed her path. Imani smiled to herself, feeling both grounded and uplifted, knowing she was part of something much larger than herself. This was more than a ripple, it was the beginning of a wave. By the time Imani arrived at the conference room for her meeting, the story of her encounter on the plane had spread well beyond San Francisco. News outlets across the country were running the story, with headlines like "VP confronts bias in first class" and "Diversity advocate takes stand against discrimination." Social media had taken her words and turned them into a rallying cry. Hashtags like #DignityInTheSky and #StandUpForRespect were trending, carrying her message far beyond the initial confrontation. As Imani entered the meeting room, her mind buzzed with a new energy, a purpose that extended beyond business negotiations. Her colleagues looked at her with a newfound respect, aware that they were standing in the presence of someone who had sparked a movement. The company's CEO, a seasoned professional known for his quiet demeanor, greeted her with an approving nod. "Imani," he said, extending his hand. "I watched the video myself. You spoke with such clarity and grace. Your words have struck a chord with millions. And frankly, they've inspired me. After seeing how you handled the situation, I believe you're the right person to lead our new diversity and inclusion initiatives." Imani felt a swell of pride and gratitude, nodding as she shook his hand. "Thank you. I'd be honored to take on that responsibility. I believe that this moment can serve as a catalyst, not only within our company but throughout our industry." The CEO gave a thoughtful nod. "Agreed. Let's start by bringing this message to the tech industry as a whole. Too often, our field has been exclusive, welcoming only a narrow vision of who belongs. It's time to change that." As the meeting began, Imani's role transformed from VP of Strategic Partnerships to a leader with a mission to create a more inclusive company culture. The deal she was in San Francisco to secure felt secondary now, a means to an end. A way to build something lasting and meaningful. They discussed strategic plans, diversity training initiatives, mentorship programs, and ways to increase representation at all levels. She was no longer just closing a deal, she was opening doors. After the meeting, Imani found herself flooded with media requests. She accepted a few key interviews, understanding that this was her chance to make a broader impact. Her first stop was a nationally televised morning show, where she was greeted with applause from the studio audience as she took her seat across from the host. The host smiled warmly. "Imani, your story has resonated with people all over the country. We've received thousands of messages from viewers who were touched by your courage and poise. Why do you think your message struck such a deep chord?" Imani took a moment to gather her thoughts, her gaze steady as she spoke. "I think my story resonates because it's not unique. Countless people face these biases every day, and they're often told to brush it off or stay silent. But there comes a time when silence isn't enough. When we speak up, we're not just defending ourselves, we're paving the way for others, challenging the structures that have held us back for far too long." The audience nodded, some dabbing at their eyes, clearly moved by her words. Imani continued, her voice filled with quiet strength. "Real change starts when we confront our own biases and hold ourselves accountable. It's about making the uncomfortable choice to challenge assumptions and open our minds. Each of us has that power." The host leaned forward, visibly inspired. "Imani, you've become a voice for so many. How can our viewers help push this movement forward?" Imani smiled, grateful for the opportunity to expand her message. "It starts with small actions. Challenge assumptions in your own life, in your workplace, in your community. Speak up when you witness discrimination, even if it feels uncomfortable. And remember, real change doesn't happen overnight, it's a journey. But each conversation, each act of courage, makes a difference." As the interview ended, the studio erupted into applause. Imani felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond words. She had spoken her truth, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong. Over the next few weeks, Imani's message continued to spread. Schools, corporations, and advocacy groups reached out to her, asking her to share her story and help guide their diversity initiatives. She received emails from parents, teachers, students, and business leaders, each sharing stories of discrimination or moments of courage inspired by her words. In the corporate world, her impact was even more profound. CEOs of major companies contacted her, eager to hear her perspective on diversity and inclusion. Her own company, TechSoul Innovations, implemented a comprehensive training program that she helped design, centered on understanding unconscious bias and building an inclusive workplace. Imani knew these were just the first steps, but they were powerful strides toward lasting change. One evening, she received an email from the businessman she had confronted on the plane. His message was sincere and lengthy, detailing the personal reflections he had undergone since that flight. Imani, he wrote, I can't begin to express how much that moment on the plane has changed me. Your words forced me to look at myself in ways I hadn't before. I've since introduced diversity workshops in my company, and I'm actively working to check my own biases every day. I know I still have a long way to go, but I want you to know that your courage has made a real impact on me, and I believe on those I lead. Imani read his message twice, her heart swelling with pride and humility. She knew that true change was a marathon, not a sprint, but every step mattered, and she was seeing those steps manifest in ways she hadn't anticipated. A few months later, Imani was invited to speak at a national conference on diversity and inclusion. Her story now a case study for tackling systemic bias and championing respect. She stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces, young professionals, corporate executives, community leaders, students, each of them drawn to her story, her vision. As she spoke, Imani could feel the power of her words resonate, reaching into the hearts of everyone in the room. She talked about her journey, her challenges, and the transformative moment on that flight, a moment that had become a movement. She spoke about courage, the importance of using one's voice, and the responsibility everyone held to foster inclusivity. The conference hall echoed with applause as she finished, and she knew this was just the beginning. She had come to the stage that day not just as an executive, but as a leader, an advocate, and a voice for change. Imani left the stage with a sense of purpose unlike any she'd felt before. The moment on the plane had been a catalyst, but what followed was a wave, one that she would continue to ride, championing change, compassion, and dignity for all. Months passed, and Imani's story continued to inspire a movement that reached across industries and communities, sparking dialogues that were long overdue. Her journey had evolved from a single, tense confrontation in a first-class cabin to a national conversation that was redefining workplace dynamics, challenging long-standing biases, and pushing for lasting change. One evening, after a whirlwind week of conferences, interviews, and leadership seminars, Imani found herself alone in her office, looking out at the city skyline as the sun set over San Francisco. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a purpose that transcended anything she'd ever experienced in her career. She hadn't just climbed the corporate ladder, she had become a beacon, a voice for countless others who had been silenced or sidelined by prejudice. As she sifted through her emails, one subject line caught her eye: "Your story changed my life." It was from a young woman named Rachel, a recent college graduate who had just started her career in tech. Imani, the email read, "I've followed your journey since I saw the video of you on the plane. I've always struggled with confidence, constantly feeling like I didn't belong. But after watching you stand up for yourself and others, I felt something shift inside me. I started speaking up at work, challenging the assumptions people made about me. I even began mentoring other young women in our industry. Thank you for showing me that my voice matters." Imani felt a surge of emotion as she read Rachel's words. She knew this story was one of many, a ripple in the vast wave of impact her actions had set in motion. People from all walks of life had reached out, each message a testament to the strength of resilience, of courage, of the simple but powerful act of refusing to stay silent. That same evening, her phone chimed with a message from her mother. "Imani, I saw an interview with you on TV today. I couldn't be prouder. You are doing what so many before you could only dream of. You're making a difference. You are our legacy." Imani's eyes misted as she thought of her parents, who had instilled in her the importance of self-respect and the courage to dream boldly. She thought of her ancestors, people who had fought for the rights she now enjoyed, who had paved the way with their own sacrifices and struggles. Her work was an extension of their journey, a continuation of the legacy of strength and determination that had brought her here. And it wasn't just her family, it was the countless people she represented. People who had fought for their voices to be heard in boardrooms, classrooms, and public spaces. People who had lived with dignity and resilience, even when faced with challenges that would break many. Imani felt a profound sense of connection to them all. A reminder that her actions were not just hers alone, but part of a much larger story. As she leaned back in her chair, she thought about the initiatives she had helped launch. TechSoul's diversity and inclusion programs had become a model for other companies. Drawing praise from across the industry, employees felt empowered, represented, and valued in ways they hadn't before. The mentorship program she developed was thriving, with professionals at all levels committing to support and uplift underrepresented voices. She reflected on the industry-wide consortium she'd helped organize, bringing together leaders from the tech, aviation, and finance sectors to tackle systemic biases collaboratively. What had once felt like an isolated struggle was now a united front, with influential companies pledging to create lasting change, from hiring practices to executive training and accountability measures. One day, as she walked into the TechSoul headquarters, she noticed something that brought a smile to her face. The lobby walls were adorned with a new display, photographs and stories of employees from diverse backgrounds, highlighting their journeys, achievements, and perspectives. It was a tangible reminder of the progress they'd made, a living testament to the impact of their collective commitment to inclusion. Her assistant approached, holding a package addressed to her from the Skies for All initiative. The airline consortium formed in response to her experience on that fateful flight. Inside was a plaque inscribed with her name and the words, "For inspiring change at 30,000 feet and beyond." As she read the inscription, a memory came rushing back, the weight of the businessman's assumptions, the pressure of those watchful eyes in the cabin, and the surge of determination that had pushed her to speak up, not only for herself but for everyone who had been made to feel small. She realized, with profound clarity, that the work they had achieved had been worth every uncomfortable moment, every challenge, every conversation. That evening, she was scheduled to address a large audience at a prestigious awards ceremony. As she stood backstage, ready to step into the spotlight, she thought back to that defining moment in the sky. She had been on her way to close a business deal, unaware that the most important deal she would strike on that journey would be one that involved her voice, her dignity, and her courage. When she finally stepped onto the stage, the applause was thunderous. She took a moment, scanning the faces before her, seeing not just an audience but a community of allies, supporters, and fellow advocates for change. "Thank you," she began, her voice clear and filled with gratitude. "What we've accomplished is the result of a collective commitment, a shared belief that we can and must do better. Change doesn't happen in isolation. It requires each of us to examine our own biases, to challenge them, and to encourage those around us to do the same. It requires courage, yes, but also resilience and the willingness to listen, to learn, and to grow." The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. "This journey has taught me that courage doesn't always come in the ways we expect. Sometimes, it starts in the quiet moments when we choose to stand up and say, 'No, this isn't right,' even if it's uncomfortable, even if we're the only voice in the room. Because every time we speak up, we create a ripple, one that can grow into a wave and change the course of entire industries, entire communities." As she concluded, she looked out over the crowd, her heart filled with a quiet certainty that this was only the beginning. She had witnessed firsthand the power of a single voice, a single act of resilience, and she knew that as long as she continued to stand up, others would follow. Imani left the stage with a sense of peace, knowing that she was no longer just an executive, no longer just a vice president of strategic partnerships. She had become a leader, an advocate, and a part of something much larger than herself. As she exited the venue, the city lights sparkling around her, she felt a profound sense of hope. Her journey had brought her full circle, back to the core of who she was and the legacy she hoped to leave. She had set out to make a difference, to turn a single moment of bias into a lasting movement for change, and she had succeeded. Imani Carter knew, deep within her, that she would continue this journey for the rest of her life, using her voice to build a world where everyone could feel seen, respected, and valued. And as she looked up at the night sky, she felt certain that this was just the beginning of a legacy that would inspire others to do the same, creating ripples of change that would reach far beyond her own lifetime.